Hello everyone, welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This week we're going to be talking about moral philosophy, or ethics. We got a lot to get through, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so first up, moral philosophy is just the philosophical study of morality. Typically, there's three different divisions to be made here. There's normative ethics, there's meta-ethics, and then there's applied ethics. This week, we're going to be talking about normative ethics, but next week, we'll get into a bit more applied. Okay, so what is normative ethics? Normative ethics is the domain of moral philosophy in which we attempt to establish moral principles, rules, or norms. So the rules that you should live by, right? That's normative ethics. We might ask questions in doing normative ethics like, what principles should we live by? And is happiness the greatest good in life? Right? Meta-ethics, on the other hand, is the domain of moral philosophy in which we examine the assumptions that guide us in normative ethics. So, for example, you might ask questions like, is there such a thing as moral truth? On what grounds can we justify our moral principles? Right? So meta-ethics is sort of beyond the normative ethics. When we think about ethical considerations, normally we're concerned with normative ethics, right? But if you really want to get down to it, you might have to do some meta-ethics as well. Applied ethics, then, is just the applying of the results of normative ethics to specific things, right? To specific cases. So you might ask questions like, is abortion ever morally permissible? Or does physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, commit some kind of moral harm? We're going to be doing some of that, specifically with abortion and euthanasia, next week. But for now, we first need to see what some of the moral theories on offer are, right? The idea is that really when you do applied ethics, what you're doing is applying those normative principles to real life cases, right? Okay, so let's look at some of the normative options that exist. Let's look at some of the moral theories we have on offer. Well, there is a number of ways to divide moral theories into different groups, different clumps. The first way that we're going to divide them is by talking about those moral theories that require reasoning and those that do not, right? So moral reasoning is just this process of reasoning from some set of rules or moral principles towards some judgment about a specific case. There are some moral theories that don't think that that is the way morality works. Here's some examples. Subjectivism, cultural relativism, divine command theory, and emotivism, right? But there are many other views that think that is how morality works, that in order to actually try to be a moral person, you're going to have to think a little bit, right? You're going to have to apply some moral reasoning. These views are things like ethical egoism, utilitarianism, and deontology. We'll also talk a little bit about the ethics of care, which we get out of feminist ethics. Okay, so let's jump into the no moral reasoning camp first. Subjectivism. Briefly put, subjectivism is just the idea that whatever you currently think about morality is true for you. So what makes something morally right just is that that person believes it is right. What makes a thing morally wrong just is that the individual thinks it's morally wrong, right? So it has to do with the individual's belief. That's what makes a thing right or wrong. The greatest benefit of this view is that it makes easy sense of the fact that we seem to disagree, right? There are many different views in the world as to what's right and what's wrong. Subjectivism gives a really easy answer to that. Well, it's because what is wrong for that person is what they say. What is right for them is what they say, right? For the objectivist, the person who thinks that subjectivism is wrong, this disagreement must mean that at least one of us, and possibly both of us, when we have a disagreement, are wrong, right? We are actually factually incorrect. Okay. Now, there are some pretty common criticisms of subjectivism. The first is that it doesn't seem able to account for moral progress, right? Moral progress is this idea that we're getting better over time, right? We are becoming more moral over time, or at least that that's possible. But if you think that someone is correct right now in their moral beliefs, because subjectivism just says what's morally right for them is what they believe, right? Then there's no reason for them to change, right? Why would they change? Why would they progress when what they think now is true, right? So it doesn't seem like it has a means by which it can account for moral progress. Okay, so critics often point to things like, the achievements like the civil rights movement. We think of these things as moral progress. But if subjectivism is true, it seems like we were right to begin with, right? So there seems to be something wrong with that. Second, it seems to imply that everyone is morally infallible. That means you cannot get it wrong, right? Infallible meaning you cannot go wrong, right? So if all it takes for a moral claim to be true is just that you really do believe it, well then you're not ever going to be wrong in your moral judgments. You can't ever be wrong, right? That seems perhaps too dogmatic, right? Okay, cultural relativism is very similar to subjectivism in that it rejects this notion of there being this objective moral standard, right? But in the case of cultural relativism, instead of saying that the individual is the measure of morality, they say one's culture is the measure of reality, right? Okay, so before getting into the view, we should understand a distinction between descriptive and prescriptive theories. A descriptive theory tries to tell us how the world is, right? It doesn't try to establish how the world ought to be. It just tries to give us the facts. This is how the world is, right? A prescriptive theory, on the other hand, tells us how the world ought to be, how the world should be. So the reason this is important to bring up here is that you can be a descriptive cultural relativist without being a prescriptive one. What does that mean? Well, it means you can accept the idea that different cultures have different moral standards. Yeah, it seems to be true. Without accepting the conclusion that that means it is morally right for them to have these different moral values, right? There's a difference between the descriptive and the prescriptive claim. All of us can accept that different cultures have different ways of doing things, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they're all correct, okay? Cultural relativism, then, is a prescriptive theory. It wants to say not just that societies have different moral codes, but that what is right for that society just is what their current moral code states, right? So whatever an individual culture says is morally good ought to be morally good for them. So many people will go this route towards cultural relativism because they believe it expresses this idea of tolerance, right? It's this idea that, hey, I don't have the ability to criticize another person's culture, right? And thus I ought to respect that they have their own views, right? So their own view is right for them, right? So it seems like this notion of tolerance leads us to something like cultural relativism. But as we'll soon see, this kind of tolerance can be used against the cultural relativist as well. Here's how. If you adopt this principle of tolerance, such that you now have to respect all cultures' moral standards, well, it becomes the case that you might have to be tolerant of another culture's intolerance, right? We can imagine there being a culture that has, or a society that has moral beliefs that are intolerant of others. Well, now, in virtue of our attempting to be tolerant and saying, well, that's true for them, right? That is morally good for them. We're allowing them to discriminate in a way that we were trying to avoid, right? But this seems to defy the principle of tolerance that we accepted in the first place. Okay. The other objections that you typically see against the cultural relativist really fall in line with the criticisms we saw against the subjectivist, right? It's the same thing. It seems like you're not going to be able to account for moral progress. Like we would like to say in the United States, for example, that we have made some, perhaps not perfect, but some moral progress since like the civil rights movement, for example. But if cultural relativism is true, then those people living in our society before the civil rights movement were right in believing as they did, right? There's no need for change if cultural relativism is true, right? Lastly, there's going to be this new problem that the cultural relativist has to do with this kind of fuzziness, right? If you say what's right for a person is to live in accord with their cultural moral norms, well, now we have to decide how those cultural moral norms are decided. What does it mean for a moral belief to be accepted by a culture? Does it mean 51% of the people in that society think that that's the case? Does it mean 75%, 90%, unanimous consent? It's not clear. And it's not clear how we would ever decide the case. Okay, so moving on from relativisms now, we're going to move to divine command theory. You have probably also heard of this one, right? Divine command theory, simply put, is the view that whatever God says is right, and whatever God forbids is morally wrong, right? So God is the creator of moral rightness and wrongness, is basically how it goes. What's interesting about divine command theory is that it can be opposed by both theists, people who believe in God, as we saw last time, right, and non-theists, right? So you can oppose divine command theory even if you believe in God. Believing in God does not mean you have to adopt command theory. Interestingly, you can also support divine command theory even if you think there is no God, right? We'll see how this works in a second. So Leibniz and Aquinas are two well-known theists who reject divine command theory. But this weird idea of accepting divine command theory while not believing in a God, we get to see in the brothers Karamazov, right? Here's a quote. If God doesn't exist, everything is permissible, right? So the idea here is that God would be the only way in which we could have some kind of objective morality. But that doesn't mean there is a God, right? So this is a kind of atheistic acceptance of divine command theory, right? We would need God for there to be morality. There is no God, therefore there's no morality, right? Okay. EUTHYPHRO dilemma. This is probably the hardest hitting objection to divine command theory that there is. The EUTHYPHRO dilemma comes out of one of Plato's dialogues called the EUTHYPHRO, right? In this dialogue, Socrates is considering what it means for the gods to be good or for the gods to be just, right? After a lot of questioning back and forth, as is Socrates' way, it seems as though he and the audience are left with a dilemma. On one hand, either the gods are good because goodness just is what the gods say it is, right? So what is goodness? It's just whatever the gods say it is. Or, on the other hand, the gods are good because goodness is somehow beyond them, right? And they champion goodness. So the gods are good or just because they are championing this thing that exists beyond them, right? So here's how the choices break down. 1, God is good just because goodness is whatever God says. That's divine command theory, right? But from this, it seems like goodness is completely arbitrary. God could have said anything is good, and it would have been good, right? Because there is no nature of good beyond what God says, there's really no reason God could have not chosen something else, right? So it seems like goodness then is completely arbitrary. Second, if you say that goodness supersedes God, right? That goodness somehow exists outside of God, from this, it seems to follow that God is not the ultimate authority on what is good and what isn't, right? In other words, we might be able to theorize towards goodness without relying on God, right? We don't need God's say to say what is good and what is not, right? Okay, so now we can start to see why some theists are going to end up rejecting the divine command theory. Here's a quote from Leibniz, again, a theistic philosopher. In saying, therefore, that things are not good according to any standard of goodness, but simply by the will of God, it seems to me that one destroys without realizing it all the love of God and all his glory. For why praise him for what he has done if he would be equally praiseworthy in doing the contrary? Where will be his justice and his wisdom if he has only a certain despotic power, if arbitrary will takes the place of reasonableness, and if in accord with the definition of tyrants, justice consists in that which is pleasing to the most powerful? So in other words, if there's no reason why God chose the things he did in order to say this thing is good, this thing is bad, well then there's no reason to praise God for being merciful or just or fair, right? No, God's commandments just seem to be arbitrary. It seems more like God is tyrannical rather than God has a certain degree of glory or mercy or justice and wisdom, right? Similarly, James Rachels has another quote here. On this view, the doctrine of the goodness of God is reduced to nonsense. It is important to religious believers that God is not only all-powerful and all-knowing, but that he is also good. Yet if we accept the idea that good and bad are defined by reference to God's will, this notion is deprived of any meaning. What could it mean to say that God's commands are good? If X is good means X is commanded by God, then God's commands are good would mean only God's commands are commanded by God. An empty truism, right? Okay, so moving on from divine command theory then, we now have something called emotivism. Emotivism is, it's a deflationary view. In philosophy, when you call something deflationary, that means it's trying to reduce the significance of the thing, right? So a deflationary view is a view that tries to reduce the significance of what it's talking about. In this case, the emotivist is going to try to argue that, look, there's really no such thing as a true or false moral claim. So when you say something like, murder is wrong, that's not true or false. It's not meaningful in that sense. Instead, when you make moral claims, you're just expressing your emotional attitude, right? You're saying something like, I don't like that, right? When you say murder is wrong, what you're actually doing is just saying, I don't like that. I don't like murder, right? It's not the case that murder is wrong really means anything at all, right? That can be true or false one way or the other. Okay, so again, you can see why this kind of view doesn't require any kind of moral reasoning, right? First, we had the subjectivisms, subjectivism and cultural relativism, which said that, well, whatever you happen to believe now is true for you. Okay, well, there's no need for reasoning then, if that's the case. Then we saw divine command theory, which said there's no need for you to reason. Just do what God says, right? God is going to give you the commands. You don't have to do anything, okay? And now we have emotivism that's saying not only do you not have to reason, but reasoning doesn't enter into morality at all, right? There's no such thing as a true moral statement. Okay, so some criticisms of emotivism then. The most common criticism is that this just doesn't fit with our standard view of morality, right? If the emotivist is correct, then really any talk of right and wrong is trivial, right? It's just an expression of emotion, right? The emotivist typically responds by just saying, yeah, it seems strange, maybe undesirable, but that is the case, right? That's how it goes. There are no moral truths. To see how that debate shakes out, we would have to do a lot more meta-ethics, right? Because we're sticking to normative ethics today, we're not really going to pursue the emotivist, but do note that there are some criticisms there that the emotivist is going to have to contend with. Okay, back to moral reasoning then. Now we'll look at the kind of views that say, no, you do have to kind of reason towards what you ought to do, ought not to do, etc., right? Okay. The first we'll consider is ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is the view that you should act to produce the most good for yourself, right? You should act to produce the most good for yourself. So it's an ethical obligation, but it's egoistic. It's for you, right? So it seems on the surface that this view might be incredibly selfish, right? It's about you, doing what's best for you, right? But it doesn't necessarily entail selfishness. Why? Because it might be the case that working with others, treating other people fairly, is the best way for you to get ahead, right? It might be in your best interest, in other words, to collaborate with others, to build a community with others, to look out for others, right? So it's not necessarily the case that the ethical egoist is going to end up being incredibly selfish, though it is still possible, right? It just depends on what ends up producing the best consequences for you, the individual. Further, for the ethical egoist, it's not that they're just saying, this is a view for me, but not for you. The ethical egoist is encouraging all of us to act this way. All of you should act to produce the most good for yourself, right? So it's encouraging you to do the same, right? In that respect, it's also maybe not selfish, right? But it also doesn't mean that you get to just do whatever you want, right? Acting to produce the most good for yourself does not mean you get to do whatever you want, right? Many times it's going to be the case that what's best for us doesn't align with what we want to do. For example, when the child doesn't want to eat their vegetables, right, their Brussels sprouts, whatever, they don't want to eat them, but it might be best for them to do, right? And therefore the ethical egoist is going to say, look, sometimes you ought to do things that you don't want to do because they actually are in your best interest, right? Okay, but how do we decide what's good for us, what's in our best interest, right? Well, ethical egoists can be torn on what they define to be the good, right? So before we're jumping into goodness here, we have to note that ethical egoists are what are called consequentialists, okay? Consequentialism is the view that what makes an action good or bad are just the consequences that come out of it, right? So we can think about consequences and intentions. Consequences or effects and motives, right? For the consequentialists, your motives, your intentions, they don't really matter that much. What really matters is what happens as a result of your action. That's how we can tell whether an action is good or bad. So for an ethical egoist who are consequentialists, they're going to say, look, the way in which we evaluate an action is going to depend on the effects of that action. Were the effects of that action actually good for you? If they were, then it was morally right. If they weren't, then it was morally wrong. It doesn't matter what your intentions were, right? Okay, so that's consequentialism. All consequentialists are going to have to work on figuring out what they're aiming towards, right? If you're saying we evaluate the morality of an action based on its consequences, you're going to have a standard by which you evaluate those consequences. Well, according to what, right? So it's going to be according to promoting goodness, but what is goodness for the consequentialist? Like all other consequentialists, ethical egoists have a few options available to them. A lot of them say that good just is pleasure, right? In which case the ethical egoist would say something like, you should act to produce the most pleasure for yourself. But it could also be other things, like security, success, knowledge, beauty, well-being. Well-being is by far the most common view of the good for a consequentialist. Okay, so why ethical egoism then? Why might we want to be ethical egoists? Well, most ethical egoists argue from the basis of psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is the descriptive view. Remember, a descriptive view is one that just tells us how the world is, right? So psychological egoism is an attempt to describe how the world is in saying that everything we do already is out of self-interest. So for the ethical egoist, there is no such thing as genuine altruism. It's already the case that everything we do is out of self-interest. If that's true, the ethical egoist argues, our moral theory ought to reflect this fact, right? Our moral theory ought to reflect this fact. Okay, so some criticisms of ethical egoism. Well, it goes against what many of us are going to think about morality, right? So for example, let's consider a case. There's a man, call him Larry, doesn't really matter, right? He is set to receive a large inheritance from his elderly father. Larry has the opportunity to smother his father in his sleep in order to gain that much needed inheritance. Larry could really use this money. And he's sure that that crime would not be discovered, right? Say he's in a situation in which he knows he could get away with it, right? Well, would this action not be in his best interest, assuming that he has no particular attachment to his father? He's been estranged, right? He would have no personal remorse or guilt whatsoever. There's a case to be made that yes, it would be in his best interest. If he's not going to be caught, he's going to massively benefit, and there are no consequences that are detrimental to him. It seems like the ethical egoist might be in a position in which they have to say, he should. Not only is it okay, but he should smother his father, right? Most of us, I think, are going to say, there's something wrong with that, right? There's something wrong with that. Okay, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is another consequentialist view, right? So again, we're talking about maximizing consequences that are deemed desirable, right? For the utilitarian, however, they hold that the right thing to do is to produce the most good over bad overall. So now forget about that idea of focusing on yourself. Now we're focusing on the overall, right? The overall. Okay. For the utilitarian, goodness just is happiness, right? Sometimes they talk about it in terms of pleasure. Sometimes, more often now, today, they talk about it in terms of well-being, right? So you ought to act to produce the most well-being overall, right? That also involves trying to avoid suffering, right? Suffering is taken to be the negation of well-being. So sometimes what you ought to do as a good utilitarian is to act to reduce suffering as much as you can, right? They're two sides of the same coin. It's radically different, as we can see pretty clearly, from ethical egoism. Indeed, the utilitarian, because they care about improving well-being overall, not just for yourself, they might on occasion demand that you sacrifice yourself for the good of the overall, right? If your moral obligations are to the overall and not to yourself as an individual, there could be cases in which absorbing a great amount of harm yourself could promote much more well-being to everyone else. And if that's a possibility, the utilitarian is going to say, you ought to do it. The ethical egoist would never, right? They could never, because you ought to act in your own best interest. So an example, it might be the case that, let's say you go to a hospital for a minor surgery, right? And while there, you discover that there are 6 people who are, on death's door. Your organs are a perfect match for all of them. And thus, your sacrifice would save 6 people. Well, because the utilitarian cares about producing the most well-being overall, it might be morally required of you to give those organs to them, to sacrifice yourself, right? The ethical egoist would never make such a claim. Okay, so let's unpack the theory a bit more. First, because it's a consequentialist kind of theory, your intentions don't matter. Your intentions really don't matter. But this can have some strange consequences. Suppose, for example, you witness a car accident and you observe that someone's stuck in the vehicle. You really want to help, so you remove them from the wreckage. But in doing so, you could cause more pain than happiness in this situation. You might, for example, accidentally cause them some irreversible spinal damage. If you did that, no matter what your intention was, your intention in this case seemed to be to help, to do what you can to help. What you did was morally wrong, because what you did ended up producing worse consequences. Okay? It does not matter what your intention was. All that matters are what the consequences were. Okay? So it can have some sort of peculiar downstream effects, right? However, we should note that utilitarianism is a theory about actions, not really about people, right? So some of our moral theories want to tell us what makes a good person, what makes a bad person. Utilitarianism is more concerned with assessing actions. So this action, they might say, was morally wrong. Does that mean that you necessarily are morally bad? Not necessarily, right? You can do something morally wrong without saying that you're a bad person. Okay. Normally, when people try to understand utilitarianism, they look at what we call the trolley problem. You're probably familiar with it because it's kind of reached into the public consciousness by now. But it's largely devised in order to make sense out of utilitarian intuitions. Here's how the trolley problem works. As you can see on your screen here, there's a runaway trolley that's speeding towards 5 people who have been tied to a set of tracks. Okay? You are on the side. You have a lever, and you can pull this lever, and the trolley will be diverted to this track where there's only one person tied down. So if you do nothing, the trolley is going to continue on, and it's going to kill these 5 people for sure. Okay? But if you pull that lever, for sure, the trolley will divert, killing only one person instead. Someone's going to die, but you have a choice to make. Okay? You don't know anything about these people. You don't know anything about them. What does the utilitarian do? Well, they pull the lever, right? Why? Because pulling the lever in order to allow only one to die means saving more people. You're increasing well-being overall, okay? You're increasing well-being overall. So you always pull the lever if you are a utilitarian. So you might have thought when you were wondering, well, what would I do? That you would pull the lever because, well, 5 is greater than 1. That's a utilitarian way of thinking, right? Okay. What if, though, the utilitarian discovered that the one person tied on the track has something like the cure for cancer or the solution to world hunger or something like that? Well, can you see that now it starts to change, right? Now they might think it's worth it to save this one person and let the 5 die. Why? Because the consequences of doing so might create more well-being overall. Okay? Might create more well-being overall. All right. Now, one way of typically pushing back on utilitarianism has to do with invoking this thought experiment of the utility monster. But the utility monster is also useful in driving home one of the points that you should understand about utilitarianism. So let's go through the case, and then I'll bring out the insight. Okay, so suppose there is a monster, right, that eats people, but it gets such immense pleasure out of eating people that all of that pleasure outweighs any degree of unhappiness that could be caused by his eating people, right? So the pain involved in being eaten, the emotional disturbance of everyone seeing someone eaten, all of these downstream effects are canceled out by how much pleasure the utility monster is getting out of eating people. Well, it seems like the utilitarian might say, you have to feed yourself to the monster. Why? Well, it's the happiness overall is higher if you do that. So it seems like maybe that's the kind of thing you should do, right? That doesn't seem like a consequence that we like, right? I don't think any of us want to line up to feed ourselves to the monster. But what this kind of thing is drawing out is that when the utilitarian says act to increase well-being overall, they are not saying act to increase well-being for the majority. This is a typical misunderstanding of utilitarianism. They do not mean to say you ought to act on behalf of the majority. Produce the most good for the most people. That's not what they're saying. They're saying produce the most well-being overall, period, right? That means that if you can concentrate a great amount of well-being into one person, and that increases overall well-being quite a lot, that option would be preferred to increasing everyone's well-being just a little bit, right? So they don't care how the well-being is distributed. They care about the overall amount of well-being when everyone has been considered. That's it, right? So there is no notion of doing the best for the majority, right? For the most. That's not utilitarianism. Okay. Another criticism that we often see against utilitarianism is that it involves this problem of no rest, right? The no rest problem has to do with utilitarianism's being a consequentialist view. If what they care about in terms of assessing whether an action was right or wrong are just the consequences, well, now it seems like we might have to evaluate all of our actions, right? All of our actions could have these downstream consequences, right? It might be the case, for example, that whether I put on my left shoe or my right shoe first in the morning is going to have some kind of downstream consequence of producing more happiness or not, right? And if that's the case, well, then it seems like the utilitarian is going to say one of those options is wrong, right? And I ought to act such to produce the best consequences all the time. So now I'm on the hook for that, right? It seems like if that's your view, it might be too demanding to be useful. Okay? All that said, many philosophers today are utilitarians. There's a few good reasons to be a utilitarian. One of them is that it gives us an idea of what we ought to be doing, right? It gives us an idea of what we ought to be doing. You ought to act such as to produce the most happiness overall. It gives us a guide by which we can act, right? Similarly, it seems to be impartial, right? Everyone, for the utilitarian, gets to count. Everyone has moral worth. Yes, sometimes the utilitarian is going to require you to sacrifice yourself to improve well-being overall, but you count. Your suffering goes into the equation there, right? So utilitarians are historically very very open to considering people who might not otherwise be considered, right? Before the abolition of slavery, they were abolitionists, right? Before women's rights, they were all for women's rights. And now, today, they're arguing still that we ought to respect non-human animals. Why? Because they can suffer, right? Because they can suffer and they can feel happiness or pleasure. Therefore, for the utilitarian, they get to count. There's a few reasons why you might want to be a utilitarian, but it also has some tangles, let's say, that you're going to have to work through. Okay, let's move on. Deontology. Deontology is just the view that what makes an action right or wrong depends on whether or not you did your duty, whether or not you followed the moral rule or law governing that action. So it's going to be the reverse of the consequentialist. They're going to say the consequences of the action do not really matter. What really matters is whether or not you are abiding by a good moral principle when you made the action, when you took the action, right? Okay, so Kant is by and large considered to be synonymous with deontology today in moral philosophy. Typically, when you're talking about deontological ethics, you're talking about Kant's ethics, okay? Now, before we get into Kant's ethics, there's a couple things you should understand, right? Because Kant is strange, right? He has a large body of work, and it's all interrelated. For example, Kant at some times seems to argue that executing murderers is a thing we ought to do out of respect for the murderer, right? And that might seem on the face of things to be a totally strange idea to you. It makes sense when you are more aware of like Kant's view at large, right? So Kant's view at large comes out of his view of rationality. We'll see more on that just a bit, right? Being a rational thing for Kant demands moral behavior. And moral behavior for Kant just is rational behavior. So what is it to be a moral thing? To be a rational being that is behaving in accordance with rationality. And what is it to be a rational thing? It's to have this sort of moral behavior, right? So they're almost interdefinable, right? Okay. So to understand how this works, we have to understand Kant's imperatives. Imperatives are just another word for rules, right? Imperatives or rules, principles that you have to abide by, come in two forms, right? We have hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives tell you what you should do just in case you want something, right? So, for example, if I want a drink of water, there might be a hypothetical imperative that I should open the lid and take a drink, right? It's like a description of the steps that you need to do in order to achieve the goal that you have. Okay, the reason why a hypothetical imperative is hypothetical is because you don't have to have these obligations unless you want the end goal, right? If I don't want a drink of water, then there's nothing requiring me to pick up the water bottle, open the lid, and have a sip, right? Nothing requires me to do that. However, if I do want the water and I don't follow those steps, I'm being in some way irrational, right? Because those are the steps that would allow me to achieve what it is I want, right? So can you already see how rationality is supposed to guide us when thinking about these imperatives? Yeah. Hypothetical imperatives, once again, you don't have to follow unless you actually want the goal, right? Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, are things that you have to do all the time, regardless of whether you want them, right? These things are universal, so they apply all the time, everywhere, and they're unconditional. There's no exceptions. These kinds of imperatives, Kant things, just come out of what it is to be rational, right? So if you're going to maintain rationality, these you have to do all the time. So the categorical imperatives then are the ones that are going to define Kant's morality, right? Hypothetical imperatives, more like practical reasoning. Categorical imperatives, that's how we're going to understand morality, right? Okay, so Kant thinks that there's really just one moral rule. There is the categorical imperative. Now he gives a few different takes on what the categorical what the categorical imperative is, right? Now he argues that they say the same thing. He argues that they say the same thing, but many people think that that's not true. We're going to see a couple of different presentations of the categorical imperative, right? Here's the first. Quote, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Okay, so what does that mean? You should do things in a way such that you're willing to make that way of doing things universal law. A maxim is just sort of the plan with which you intend to achieve your goal, right? So the idea is this. You should only act in a way that your plan is a plan that everyone can do as well, right? That everyone else can do. So act only in such a way that your plan can be done by everyone else and it's still possible for you to achieve your goal, right? If the answer is no, you cannot do that. You can't, if everyone else were to adopt your plan, you would not be able to achieve your goal, then you're behaving irrationally and therefore immorally, right? We'll see some examples soon. Stealing cars, not the best example. The most common example that Kant uses has to do with promises, right? So suppose you enter into a promise with the intent to break it. Kant calls this a lying promise, right? You are lying when you make the promise. Well, your goal is to achieve whatever it is that the promise is going to get you, right? Now assume that everyone behaves that way all the time, right? Whenever anyone is entering into a promise, they're intending to break it, okay? Well, Kant says you cannot then achieve your goal. Because if everyone knows that when everyone makes a promise, when anyone makes a promise, they're going to be lying about it, right? They're going to break it. That's the way people behave. Then no one's going to give you anything because of your promise. Thus, you're not going to be able to achieve your goal if everyone were to do the same thing you did. Thus, you're behaving irrationally, right? That's kind of how this works. The same thing applies to lying, right? If you were to tell a lie in order to achieve some goal, right? Let's say, for example, you wanted to tell someone a lie in order to get some money, right? You told them, oh, no, I gave you $20, not $10. So you owe me more change, right? Your goal there is to have some kind of economic benefit, something like that. Well, if you were to ask, can everyone behave this way all the time and my goal still be achieved? The answer is going to be no. Or because now everyone knows that the standard way of behaving is to lie. And so when you lie to this person saying, oh no, I gave you a 20, not a 10, they're not going to take you seriously. They're not going to think of that as any means by which your claim is validated, right? That you in some way deserve more money from them. No, they're going to assume that you're lying because everyone does. And thus, universalizing your maxim shows that you cannot achieve your original goal, right? Thus, it's immoral because you're behaving inconsistently for Kant. Okay, moving on then. The test for determining acceptable moral behavior goes like this. You ask two questions. First, is it possible for everyone to continue to act this way every time they're in the same situation? Second, would you still be able to achieve your initial goal if that were the case? If you answer yes to both questions, then the action is okay. It's morally permissible. You can do it. But if your answer is no to either of these, then the action is morally impermissible. It's something you cannot do. Okay, another example. Suppose that you come up upon a highway and it's majorly backed up with traffic. You decide that in order to avoid the traffic, you're going to drive along the side of it, right? The emergency lane. Well, let's run through Kant's system, right? Is it possible for everyone to act that way? Sure, everyone could try to drive in the emergency lane. Okay. But could you achieve your initial goal if everyone did that? Could you achieve the goal of avoiding traffic if everyone did that? No, because now the traffic is just going to be spread. It's going to be expanded to include another lane, right? So you're not going to be able to achieve your goal if everyone does this. Okay. Second form, the categorical imperative. It seems fairly distinct, but again, he assures us they're the same. It goes like this. Act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end withal, never as a means only. What does this mean in English? We call it the means-end principle. It means this. Treat other people as ends in themselves. Don't treat anyone as a mere means. Okay? Treating someone as a means is basically to use them as a tool to achieve your goal, right? So never treat anyone as a mere means, right? Everyone has their own goals. Everyone has their own intentions, and you have to respect that that's the case, right? In recognizing the rationality in others, you have to accept that they have their own goals. If you treat someone as a mere means, what you're doing is denying that they are a rational being. And that is a violation of rationality and therefore immoral for Kant. See how it goes? Okay. There are a few ways in which we can test Kant's moral principle, right? These are, we're going to go through two cases. These are the two cases that are most typically given to object to Kantian ethics. Test one has to do with harboring innocence, right? So imagine, for example, that you are hiding some innocent people from some malintentioned authority figures. It could be hiding Jews from Nazi soldiers. More updated is, or more relevant here, is something like you're part of the Underground Railroad, and so you're hiding a runaway slave, right? If you're hiding this runaway slave, and a slave catcher comes knocking at your door and asks, are you hiding any slaves here, right? It seems like you have two options. You can lie in order to protect them, or you can tell them the truth and put these innocent people at great risk, right? Well, Kant's moral principles are supposed to be absolute. They're supposed to make no room for exception. And if that's the case, you can never lie. Why? Because lying is not universalizable, right? If everyone were to lie all the time, you're not going to be able to achieve your goal that you had that encouraged the lying in the first place. and therefore it's always forbidden. But being honest here clearly isn't the moral choice, right? Kant struggled with this himself. He thought, yeah, there's no room for exception. It's a rough part of the view, right? Test 2, keeping promises. Same kind of idea. Suppose that you borrowed a rifle, right, a gun, from a friend. You were going to do some hunting with it, something like that, under the condition that whenever they came asking for it, you would give it back to them. You made a promise, right? Suppose further your friend has endured some recent hardships and has been talking about committing suicide. Well, if they come back asking for the gun, does it seem like the moral thing to do to give it back to them? I think a lot of us would say no, absolutely not, right? But because Kant says there's no room for exceptions, you have to keep your promises all the time. Forget the consequences, right? Again, for Kant, the consequences don't matter. Okay, so there's a few problems with Kant's view, but there are a few things to like as well, right? For instance, Kant has us recognize that everyone has intrinsic value. So unlike the utilitarian who said, hey, you might have to sacrifice that one person in order to save the 5. Hey, we might have to feed ourselves to the monster if that's how well-being works out. Kant says, no, you can never, ever treat another person as a mere means. You are not allowed to do that, right? As a consequence, when we think about the trolley problem, for example, he would not be able to pull the lever. Why? Because pulling the lever, killing the 1 in order to save the 5, would be treating that one person as a mere means to save the 5, right? So if when we considered the trolley problem, you thought, oh no, I could never pull the lever, you might align more with Kantian ethics, right? Second, Kant has us think seriously about the ramifications of our views, right? What would happen if I universalize this plan of action, this maxim? Right? However, because Kant doesn't make room for exceptions, we're going to always be able to build up these criticisms like we were with the runaway slave and the promise making, right? Okay, sometimes we think it might be okay to tell a little lie or to break a promise. All right, moving on. Ethics of care, last moral theory we're going to talk about. The ethics of care comes out of feminist ethics. And largely, feminist ethics are a reaction. They're reactionary to trends that we were seeing in moral philosophy up until them, right? So until feminist ethics, moral philosophy was almost exclusively done by men, many of whom viewed women as inferior moral agents. Aristotle specifically was very bad, right? They often ignored the specific moral plights of women, and they often underemphasized some morally relevant values that are considered traditionally feminine, things like community, emotions, and trust. Instead, moral philosophy up until feminist ethics seems to hyperemphasize, by the way, this kind of philosophy still continues, right? Seems to hyperemphasize values like objectivity, rationality, and independence, right? Okay, so generally speaking then, feminist ethics place an emphasis on personal relationships, rely less on moral principles that are supposed to apply to all cases, and give more consideration to our emotions. By the way, thinking that we ought to give consideration to our emotions does not mean we think that all moral decisions must be made emotionally. Rather, the idea is something like, emotions can be a useful guide to figuring out what our conclusions should be about morality, right? So if you had a reaction against not telling a lie ever and thus having to risk the runaway slave's security, if you thought, no, that's disgusting, how could you do that? Well, it seems like maybe your emotions are being something of a guide to morality there, right? They give up on this idea of an ideal human that most of these other moral theories have in mind. Kant specifically, right? That there is something that there is to be an ideal rational agent. So the ethics of care is a specific view in feminist ethics. More or less, it says that our moral obligations to people depends on how we're connected to them. So for example, because I have a greater relationship with my family, I might have more moral obligations to them than I have to strangers, for example. Now, that does not mean that I don't have any moral obligations whatsoever to strangers. It just means that I have more of them to people I'm closer to. So your degree of moral obligation is going to depend on your degree of closeness, right? It's going to depend on your degree of closeness. Why is that the case? Well, it's because you have, one, more opportunity to meet the needs of those people that are closer to you, and two, you're going to have a better idea of what their needs are, right? So you've got a better chance to meet the needs, and you have a better chance of understanding what the needs actually are. That's why the ethics of care suggest that our moral obligations ought to be contextualized based on our connection, based on these relationships of care to one another, right? Okay, so you have greater moral obligations to your own child because you're in the best position to know and meet their needs. See how this is remarkably different from something like Kantian ethics, which says, no, there's this one way of dealing with people, and that's it. There is one moral rule, that's it. And utilitarianism, which said, there's this one moral rule, and that's it, right? It doesn't matter if they're your own child, it doesn't matter who they are. All we care about is the overall well-being. Ethics of care is saying, no, we need to rebuild in these notions of being connected to other people, right? So what should we do? Well, the ethics of care, like most feminist ethics, can't really advise you on what specific actions you should take. But that's because only you truly understand your context and the needs of the people that you're involved with, right? So they have kind of eschewed this idea of being able to offer you this universal moral principle that's going to guide you in all things, right? Instead, focus on the relationships you have with others. Build up this sense of care, this appropriate sense of care between them. Okay, so that's a lot, right? We covered a lot of moral theories. There are still many more within moral philosophy, but here we have touched on the big ones, right? Next week, we're going to talk about applied moral philosophy. So we're going to look at the issue of abortion and euthanasia. We're going to try to apply these moral theories to these problems, right? We're going to see how we might be able to use them. Okay, so until then, stay healthy, stay safe.